I'm very honored to be here and with all the speakers I've begun to hear this morning because they are very famous. And for myself, I'm a cardiovascular surgeon in France, and I apologize for my English, which is not so good. So if you have any problem, let me, you can ask a question at the end if there is something which you don't understand. My topic is about atheroma and paleo diet. This topic is focused on the connection between diet and atheroma, because now we are aging, it's an evidence, but we are also spending a lot of time with chronic disease, and atheroma is one of the most chronic disease with severe complications. The cardiovascular surgeon faces two serious situations. First, the complication of atherosclerotic lesions in coronary arteries, in carotid arteries, and peripheral arteries. Second, lung cancer, when it is possible to resect it. All these situations are very important for the patient, and they are linked to smoking and diet. In this review, I will devote this review only to atheroma and the connection with diet. The question is, what is relevant in the paleo diet about the prevention of atheroma? What is atheroma? We will share three topics. First, the conventional view. Second, the importance of oxidized lipids. And third, we will see the problem of postprandial hypothesis and the role of the postprandial hyperlipemia. What is atheroma? You can see here on this slide, on this slide you can see a plaque inside the carotid artery. I am removing through the neck incision in a patient who had multiple transient ischemic attack. The plaque is removed, and you can see inside that the plaque is ruptured. For those who don't know atheroma, you can imagine what is the tremendous effect of such a deposit, such an obstruction in the artery which goes to the brain. And you can be very feared by the lesion you can see inside on the right side here, where the plaque is ruptured and a lot of platelets are in the rupture and can embolize in the brain. In this other patient, you can see the same lesion with heavily blocked artery, and here a thrombus which formed inside the plaque, the ruptured plaque. So that's atheroma. The conventional view tells us that LDL particles enter the subendothelial space and accumulate inside the vessel. I insist that it's not inside the lumen, but inside the vessel wall, the arterial wall. This conventional view is very well figured in the slides which will follow, and previously I will insist on the size of the particles. Those particles, which are on the left side here, are of different size. You can see that the small dense particles of LDL, which are produced by the industrial diet and the high glycemic index food, are very small. They can enter the subendothelial space, as we will show in the next slide, because the space between the two endothelial cells is 26 nanometer, and the LDL is inferior of 25 millimeters. So these small LDL, dense LDL, enters the subendothelial space, and then here in the conventional view, they are phagocyted by the macrophages. They initiated an immunological reaction with antibodies, which leads to these enormous plaques, but only in decades. Peter Libby, in a recent paper in Nature, figured the process in these 4 drawings. First, you have to keep in mind that here the subendothelial space is very different in man, in human, than in other mammals. We have in this space a lot of smooth muscle cells which trigger a very fast and important inflammatory reaction when there is a xenobiotic or an allergen or molecules which is recognized as foreign molecules. So this particularity is that when the LDL enter the subendothelial space here, you have the inflammatory reaction which leads to this plaque, which is at the beginning a fatty streaks inside the wall. And in this fatty streak, there are a lot of smooth muscle cells which are dividing, and then after you have the complications I have shown in the first slides in the patient with stroke or transient ischemic attack. Also in the conventional view, there are an efflux mechanism for cholesterol to return to the liver through another particle, which is the HDL particle, the so-called good cholesterol. This efflux mechanism allows free cholesterol and cholesterol ester to go to the liver, and they are picked up in the macrophages through some cassette, which are proteins, and then the cholesterol is going to the liver. Aside from this conventional view, we have to emphasize on one first point. Native LDL are not phagocyted by macrophages. Only modified LDL, and modified means oxidized LDL, are phagocyted. And this is very important to understand because the native LDL, which are full in natural and whole food, are not atherogenic. Only oxidized LDL are atherogenic. And this heterogeneity is due to the fact that the fats inside the LDL are modified by oxidation. They are modified by an oxidative stress, and this oxidative stress is a phenomenon which is always encountered in atherosclerotic plaques. The NADPH oxidase activity is very high in atherosclerotic plaque. And when we look at this slide, we can see that these enzymes which oxidize and trigger the inflammatory process inside the vessel are always and in all the layer of the arterial wall. So the process became a cascade and it improved itself. So when oxidized LDL enter the subendothelial space, they trigger a reaction with a tremendous inflammatory effect. And this inflammatory and immunological effect leads to the accumulation of other cells, the apoptosis of macrophages, and the development of the plaque. Without oxidized LDL, it's very difficult to have a plaque formation. And this slide remember us that it's one of the reasons why antioxidants doesn't work in the prevention of atheroma. First, patients have very important lesions, as I have showed in the first slides. So the process is very old, about 2, 3, 4 decades. Second, when you look at the reaction, the chemical reaction, you can see that before the vitamin E, for instance, which is a potent antioxidant, act with the superoxide anion, this vitamin E cannot do that because previously the reaction occurred with the nitric oxide, and it is 6 orders of magnitude than the reaction with vitamin E. That's some reasons why taking supplements never succeeded to prevent atheroma. The second problem is to localize the place where lipids are oxidated. And they can be oxidated before eating, especially in the kitchen, after eating in the body, and in the body it is the problem of inflammatory states. Smoking, lack of physical activity, and so other many risk factors increase the inflammatory states and then increase the potential of oxidation of lipids even when they are not oxidized previously. These oxysterols and oxidized lipids trigger inflammation, but also a plaque vulnerability. It means that it triggers a plaque rupture, like I showed in the first slide. So when your plaque is building, the events will be more frequent and they occurred more rapidly when you continue to eat oxidized lipid or to oxidize your lipids inside your body. The modern diet is an inflammatory signaling diet. You can see here the different reasons why, from low UVB exposition and low vitamin D status, high adipose tissue, cooking food with high temperatures in presence of oxygen, and a very high omega-6, omega-3 ratio, which leads to an inflammatory chronic state. The second point, which is aside the conventional view on atheroma, is the importance of postprandial hypothesis. In modern diet, we have a very high hyperlipemia in the postprandial period. This postprandial lipemia leads to the circulation of a lot of chylomicrons remnants, which are lipid particles, which are very atherogenic. They are very atherogenic because they link to the subendothelial space specifically. Experimentally, Proctor and al. Showed that the chylomicron remnants linked to the subendothelial space by the ApoB48 lipoprotein. Clinically, we know that measuring fasting triglyceride is misleading. We have to measure postprandial triglyceride, and if you correlate the postprandial triglyceride to the importance of atheroma by ultrasons on the carotid artery, by instance, you have a high correlation between these two values. So high postprandial triglyceride are highly atherogenic. Example, on the left side, you see fluorescent remnants of chylomicrons in the subendothelial space. Keep in mind that the purple is the extracellular matrix and not the cell. So the remnants linked to this extracellular matrix. And when we look at the place where they're linked, it's very diverse. It's very different from one side, one part of the artery, but always in the subendothelial space where the plaque is beginning. Second example. Here are the consequences, the physical consequences of milk homogenization. You look at the right column, and you can see that the number of fat globules after homogenization is increasing. The surface is quite 10 times the first surface, and so when you homogenize milk, you increase the postprandial lipemia because you increase the absorption, the digestibility of milk, of fat milk, through the process of homogenization. There are a lot of examples of that in the industrial diet, which show that a lot of process increase the digestibility of fat. And by the way, the lipemia after your meal. So on this slide, you can see that a high-fat meal with some modifying factors, processing and so on, genes, leads to postprandial lipemia and then to the plaque and atheroma. Then we are going to the next topic. What is paleo diet and what is relevant to atheroma in paleo diet? It's a very difficult topic because it's difficult to study the different paleo diets. It's difficult to know what is the true diet of our ancestors, but we have some things which are quite sure. First, in this period, from the last Australopithecus to the Homo sapiens sapiens, we tripled the brain capacity. It's with brain wiring, brain genes, but also with diet, and especially long pure fat diet, long omega-3 pure fat diet, which is possible only on the coastal border of lakes or of sea, because we cannot find these long omega-3 pure fat in the savanna, for instance. Methodological considerations are very important because we know some things, but there are big limits of our knowledge in the matter. For instance, in this study, which was done in Europe from our ancestors and your ancestors also, we can emphasize that men at this time depend on ecological niche, and especially then depends on small carnivores. When the carnivores disappeared, men do not survive or quit or go away from this niche. So there are a lot of links between the human populations of this time and carnivores because they rely on this source of meat. What we are quite sure is that those foods were never eaten by paleo man, you know, and I would like to emphasize that it is 62.1 0.1% of the calorie, which are not paleo in our Western diet. In this view, we can see that our vitamin content, especially the vitamin C and vitamin E, which are very important for atheroma because they are potent, very potent antioxidant, these decreased. In the same time, the total fat, the saturated fat, the trans fat increase, and the omega-3 and decrease in the last 2 centuries. So our ratio of omega-6, omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids is now very different from the paleo era. We have a content of micronutrients which is very, very low. And then these data combined to the increased amount of fat that we have in our meals lead to conditions that allow the accumulation of oxidized lipids in the subendothelial space of arteries. In the in the paleo era, the postprandial state was quite different. First, it was short. Instead of that, now we spend between 9 to 12 hours in the postprandial state. For some of our human persons in our Western societies, the time spent in postprandial state is quite 80 to 90% because they are in a continuous feeding state. It's a huge difference between the paleo era and our modern era. So, what evidence are that paleo humans are free of atheroma? What are the evidence? They are very, very controversial. I have to tell you that first. In the Neolithic period, we have some remains, and especially Otzi. Otzi was found in mountains, in the Alpian mountains, and the body was very well conserved. So we can see here, and I have these slides from Dr. Paul Gostner from Italy, that on the right iliac artery, there are calcifications and atheroma, atherosclerotic lesion. You can see here that there are also atherosclerotic lesion. But it is probably because Otzi lived in caves with open fire and he has very heavy smoker lungs. So the oxidative stress was of environmental origin and not from the diet. So you see there is a bias, and so it's difficult to analyze the lesions. Second example, recently, this year, the Horus study from Mumis showed that coronary arteries of the princess of Egypt were heavily calcified, and they have atheromatous lesions in about 50 to 60%. But in this case, it's not paleo diet, it's Neolithic diet. They ate grains, they ate milk and dairy products, they ate beer, and they have also probably a very high availability of food and fat foods. But nevertheless, it's a controversial issue because cardiologists usually believe that atheroma is a natural aging process. Unfortunately, the Kitava study is not in keeping with this fact. They found that in the Kitava humans, which are paleo, mainly vegan style with fish, there are no indication of coronary heart disease or stroke. There are good lipid profile, and especially the LDL cholesterol is low. So the question remains, we have not evidence that in the paleo era there are no atheroma, but we have evidence that atheroma will be rare or very delayed. Then we are going to look at the clinical trials. There are two kinds of clinical trials. First, a lot of clinical trials about diet which mimic one trait or one characteristic of the paleo diet. And then one study of paleo diet versus Mediterranean diet. The caloric restriction is the most impressive diet which has been tested about atheroma. As you can see here, the results are tremendous. The LDL cholesterol on caloric restriction in normal individuals is very low versus the controls. Also, the fasting insulin is quite low. The CRP, which is a good marker of inflammation, of chronic inflammation, is very low. So, as far as I know, the caloric restriction is the most effective diet I have found with data in the literature about the prevention of atheroma and the effect on the lipid profile and also on intimal media thickness measured by ultrasounds. This is so tremendous that recently a study could prove that with caloric restriction, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, can be reversed. It's a 600 kilocalories per day study. It's very, very severe, very tough to implement, but the result is that they recover their insulin sensitivity. It's the first study who shows that. And the LDL cholesterol dropped also in this study. You know that med diets and omega-3 diets have had also a tremendous effect on cardiovascular disease, especially sudden death, but also the progression of atheroma and plaques. They mimic partly a paleo diet, because when you do med diet, a very good med diet, you give to the patient a lot of polyphenols, a lot of whole food, and you reduce all the other industrial products. When you give omega-3, either alpha-linolenic acid, or like in the LION study, or when you give long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, you mimic the condition of paleo diet when we had natural occurrence of these fatty acids in the diet. And they are very effective in the prevention of atheroma. And last but not least, the paleo versus med diet was done recently by Lindenberg, and they showed that the paleo diet, it's a small study, but it's a very interesting study. The paleo diet is more effective on the lipid profile than med diet. So, atheroma, we can try caloric restriction, we can try alpha-linolenic acid, you can try long-chain PUFA, we can try a vegan style with fish, the so-called Plio-Pleistocene diet, and we can try to increase our omega-3, omega-6 ratio. All these characteristics are the characteristic of the paleo diet. So it's not a very great transition to say that we have some evidence that paleo diet can do a great role in the prevention of atheroma. And then I'm coming to my conclusion. So we have seen that evolution of human diet shows that the most ancestral diet, the Pleo-Pleistocene diet, leads to none or very teeny atherosclerosis lesions, especially in monkeys. Paleo diet, the same. Neolithic diet is atherogenic through diet, but also through other environmental conditions and exposition, pollutants with open fire in the caves. But industrial diet, either 20% of industrial products or 99%, as we can show, we can see now in our Western countries, is very atherogenic through diet, but also smoking, sedentarity, and other pollutants. We have to resist to the idea that we can treat a so complex chronic disease as atheroma with a single factor, okay? That's the reason why paleo diet is a pleiotropic diet. It uses the reducing of LDL cholesterol, the decreasing of the omega-6, omega-3 ratio, a low-fat diet, a low CH diet, and low GI diet, and but more than med diet or endo-med diet or Japanese diet, paleo diet is very powerful to prevent and to normalize lipid profile. It is my conviction that on the present studies, paleo diet is a good candidate to diet prevention of atheroma. It is important to know that, to note that this diet is presently not very popular because almost all cardiologists and nutritionists are now, like I mentioned in this slide, nutri-creationists. They don't want to look at our ancestral diet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. We have time for questions for a few minutes, so raise your hand. One thing to do is state your name and maybe if you have an association that you'd like to share when you ask your question.
Can you stand up? Because it's more easier for others to listen.
My name is Kamal, and I have a question about vitamin E. So you had a slide about the inefficacy of vitamin E, and then there was also a slide about how we have a lower intake of vitamin E nowadays. And I know that trials have shown higher all-cause mortality from vitamin supplementation. What's the role of both dietary antioxidants as well as endogenous antioxidants in heart disease? Because people wonder sometimes if they're getting enough vitamin E because on a paleo diet you don't get the vitamin E that comes with your liquid oils. So sometimes vitamin E intake is very low, non-existent.
It's a very good question. I'm not sure that the content of vitamin E in the paleo diet is low. I will take an example. When you eat an avocado, do you know that the content of vitamin E is very, very high? And on the other hand, when you take 3 or 4 spoons of filtered olive oil or filtered rapeseed oil, all the vitamin E is kept in the filter in order to be sold in supplements and so on. So I'm not sure that paleo diet is low in vitamin E. I haven't seen, I haven't read any paper about that. And I think that the whole food of paleo diet are very rich in vitamin E. But the second point is that I think that the problem of antioxidants must be thought as an equilibrium. If you have an equilibrium because of very high antioxidant state in your blood from the diet, you will not have the inflammatory cascade and that I shown in atheroma. And one of the best means I know to have a high antioxidant power in the blood is to have a very rich diet in polyphenols with vitamin E, with vitamin C, because all the chain of antioxidants are mandatory. Oh, excuse me. This. No. Next.
You mentioned that we should be measuring postprandial triglycerides. About how long postprandial should we measure them, and what values would you consider problematic?
Now, this measure should be arranged with your lab because it depends on the load of the meal, and it depends on some technical points. So you have to arrange that with your lab. Your lab could give you the protocol and then the normal value. But nevertheless, we know that coronary artery disease patients have usually above 50% of triglyceride levels at 3 hours after the meal than normal controls. It's huge. We never had this difference in LDL cholesterol, by the way. Your name.
David Wood.
Okay.
As an alternative to measuring triglycerides, which require a lab, require a number of things, I'm wondering what you think of the idea of measuring blood sugar, which is far easier, consumer-oriented, available consumer, and perhaps is a correlated precursor to triglycerides.
You're right. You're right. You can measure blood sugar, but you have some patients, especially at the beginning with young patients, where they haven't a complete insulino resistance and they have very high triglycerides. It depends also on genes. It depends also of the type of diet they have, and you know that it's very complex. Each patient has his own diet, you know. So you can miss some high triglyceride by the normal glucose in the blood, I think. But when the patient is after 50, you're right. Usually with high triglyceride, postprandial triglyceride, you have a high blood glucose. You, please.
My name's Arvin, no affiliation. You made a differentiation between, I think you call it good fats and fast fats. So I'm not asking about the fat differentiation, but you had a chart that showed, I'm going from memory, about 20% fat intake and then a divergence that occurred with the increase of fat consumption in recent times. So what I'm asking is, are you suggesting that that 20% level is somehow, from a macronutrient composition perspective, optimal? Versus some of the paleo community that feels that very high fat diets are not only tolerant but actually preferred, and how does that relate perhaps to your own dietary preference?
Yes. The problem of high fat diet in the paleo is a good point. First, you have to keep in mind that in the paleo diet, fats are slow fat because you eat tissues. You eat all nuts, all avocados. You don't eat refined and filtered vegetable oils. You shouldn't. It's not paleo, first. The second point is the amount of fat in the diet. This point was addressed this morning by Lauren Cordain, And it's not the same thing that I have shown, because what I have shown is the trend in the fat consumption by the mean of the Industrial Revolution and the refined fats, essentially vegetable oils. It doesn't mean that I advise 20%. It means that we observed this trend, and we observed the incidence and the prevalence of atheroma. That's all.
So can I ask then, do you advocate though a certain macronutrient ratio, or are you macronutrient independent and more focused on the toxins than perhaps are?
Probably, yes. Yeah.
You made a question about calorie restriction. Calorie restriction has never been shown to be beneficial in humans or even in the great apes. It's been very promising in lower animals, especially like C. elegans. So here's my real question. Metformin and resveratrol and some of the other polyphenols have been shown to do the same thing that calorie restriction does. Taking that a step further, the paleo diet, when it's what I would call at its nth degree, basically is a calorie restriction diet because it allows people to actually eat much less over a long period of time. So how would this fit in to your belief that a calorie restricted diet actually would decrease atheroma? And specifically, do you think it has something to do with the oxidized LDL in the wall of the atheroma, or is it actually more with the carotid intimal thickness in terms of how thick it would be? I know that's a loaded question.
Yes. I'm not sure that caloric restriction haven't never showed any effect. You can read the paper in Science about monkeys, and only the photos give you a good idea of what kind of transformation you observed in monkeys when you used caloric restriction instead of ad libitum diet. The second point is about, if I have well understood, but you can interrupt me if it's not the case, that the paleo diet is a form of caloric restriction on the long term, obviously. Why? Because the satiety is very high with all food. Try to eat a steak tartare and then a very well done steak. You will eat about, I've done the experience, about the double amount with cooked meat. When you eat avocados, you will stop very early. If you eat olive oil, you can pour a lot of spoons in your salad. So paleo diet is rather restrictive naturally because your brain feels very well the taste, and you have the normal functioning of the neurophysiological process of satiety.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yeah. Excuse me. No. Yeah. You are in the same direction, so I'm sorry.
Marty Wilson with Decathlon Wellness, and I was just wondering, what percentage of cardiologists would you think that you represent? Is it a coming tide? Are we going to be more paleo-centric in the future? Because so many people believe it's going to be the red meats and that kind of thing that's going to cause a heart attack. Do you see a changing tide, and do you get pushback in your medical community?
Yes. Frankly, the question is very easy to answer. We are very few cardiologists and surgeons and nutritionists who are involved in the paleo diet. But when you speak with your patients, you you have to mention that the present steak, grain-fed steak with high omega-6 loading, cooked with high temperature, indeed favor atheroma. So you have to address your advice to very conscious people, and it is my practice. When the patient is ready to hear what I believe is the truth, I will put an advice with the statins. If not, I will not waste my time. But at the present time, we are very few. And the last question, perhaps, Bram? No?
Yes, real quick.
Okay, very quickly. I'm not sure to have completely understood your question.
I was wondering, do you have any good studies I can cite that will show that saturated fat is not causing plaque if it is not processed?
We have that with coconut. We have a meta-analysis on saturated fat, and we have several studies on coconut fat, which shows that there are no incidents on the intimer media thickness of the carotid artery.
Yeah, there's a Krause, K-R-A-U-S-E meta-analysis on that you can look up. So thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause.